Welcome to our webinar, Seeing 2020, Digital Transformation is People Transformation. Since Corp has been around for over 2 decades, offering a variety of consulting services across data, digital, and business transformation. Our team of skilled consultants offer insights and solutions to the most important problems facing business and government. Today, I have the pleasure of introducing our speaker, Jeff Dixon. Jeff is our Since Corp Organizational Change Management Practice Lead with extensive experience in business transformation strategy, stakeholder engagement, and empowering organizations to successfully foster and indoctrinate change. Okay, thanks for attending today's webinar. We're going to go ahead and get started. Jeff, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Kelly. I appreciate it, and glad everybody has taken the time on a Friday afternoon to talk about what I assume is a common interest, and that is how we make sure that we don't lose sight of our people in the course of digital transformation. No doubt your company is wrestling with the advent of increasingly sophisticated technology as a means to drive digital transformation. But if I can leave you with one takeaway from today, it's that digital transformation is people transformation. What I'm seeing increasingly with the companies that I work with is a struggle to transition a workforce facing the omnipresent need to present, adapt, and change in the digital era. In simple terms, our mission collectively is to transform organizations for the digital era. You all are very familiar with the landscape. Digital disruption is all around us. These are but a few examples where industries have literally been entirely disrupted by this technology. So ultimately the question is, what are we to do? Well, I guess at the simplest level, it's to disrupt or be disrupted. And of course, while that's a simple principle, it's anything but easy. And the results, unfortunately, are startling. 3 out of 4 projects fail despite literally trillions of dollars invested in transformation programs. And really that leads us to an inexhaustible conclusion that we have to change the game. And companies are beginning to find that the real driver behind successful transformation in the digital era boils down to one indisputable truth, that people transformation is the key to success. And this is corroborated by independent research that conclusively 2/3 of transformative value is coming from people-centric applications. In other words, people to machine. And what's really counterintuitive is that number has actually risen since it was first measured in 2013. So you would think with the advent of technology that percentage would be going down, but it's just the contrary. And in really the seminal work that's done with global CIOs and the surveys of 2018, what has been cited as the single most important skill for the future is delivering major organizational change, followed very closely by building high-performing teams. So this is obviously evidence that people still remain at the center of transformational efforts. So what are the implications? So from a broad standpoint, one, we have to think about the division of labor between people and machines. And the prognosticator suggests that in the coming years, that up to 1/3 of our current jobs are going to be disrupted in some measure by the replacement of repetitive and routine tasks. Secondly, there's a whole new set of ethos out there that's thinking about what about this corroboration between human and machine and what are the implications. And of course, one of the most palpable ones is the wearables, which have become very pervasive. Amazon and all the distribution companies have adopted these with what they call haptic technology, which if any of you have your car seat that rumbles as you start to veer across a lane, that's haptic technology. So it's really starting to move into kinesthetic sphere, and that really starts to beget some questions about ethics and the cohabitation of machine and person. And then of course, training, the whole idea of reskilling and upskilling is very daunting, particularly as we look at the numbers that are suggested in terms of upskilling the workforce. The thing is, we have to be very intentional about how we do that, and we'll talk a little bit about that today. And finally, the whole trend towards mobility and flexible working. I mean, today, 2 out of 5 workers are working remotely, and that percentage is moving to better than half in the coming years. So ultimately, that leads us to, if 2/3 of transformative value is coming from people-centric applications, how do we ensure that our people remain on board? So what I'm going to do is just briefly talk about really 4 of the prevailing digital environments or transformations that are taking place, and just talk a little bit about how that technology shows up. And then, as importantly, how can we ensure that we're leveraging the distinct advantages of human and technological interventions? So the first we'll talk about is robotic process automation. And well, we'll refer to that as RPA for short. Ultimately, this can automate mundane rules-based business processes, and ultimately the objective is to enable business users to devote more time to serving customers, obviously, and providing higher value work. So there's a number of applications, too many to enumerate here, but in the simplest terms, RPA means using software, what's often referred to as a robot, to perform these high volume, rules-based, repetitive tasks that are typically carried out by a human being. So just some sample use cases, and the one that I like to use just as an example is like a 3-way match for payables. So now these robots, so-called, can extract invoices and place them in a work queue, and using complementary cognitive technology can capture that data in a semi-structured way, and then put it into an ERP invoice template, take it through the validation process, get it indexed back into the queue, make the post to the ERP system, and ultimately send to the customer for archiving, and even sending invoices that failed validation, sending them back for exception handling. So these are the types of things that we're seeing. And this is really attractive technology to industry for a couple of reasons. One is you can take these sub-processes that are typically very rote, have literally thousands of iterations, and have those as inherent tasks for RPA technology. Secondly, it's a means by which to go through the ever painful ERP integration, and to be able to get those efficiencies and economies that typically were only available in a full ERP implementation. So what's the posture that we can take with our employees? I'm sure some of you recognize Mr. Carson here from Downton Abbey. So the whole idea is that we're really moving from personal assistants to RPAs. And so instead of coffee being the fuel of our past, it's obviously ones and zeros. And the whole idea here is that the RPA is intended to supplement and enhance what it is that our human labor is capable of doing. And really importantly, what we need to do is deconstruct jobs down into tasks, because I think the inherent fear of any employee is that their job in whole is at risk. And we need to kind of change that paradigm and get them to thinking about the various tasks that are performed and which ones really lend themselves most effectively to RPA. And that way, that frees them up in order to do more fulfilling work. So that's really changing the ecosystem. And the question becomes, how do we get our ecosystem to really work effectively between human and machine? And the first thing that we suggest is that you step back, and as you look at these tasks, think about which ones are complex versus complicated. So for definition purposes, complex problems involving too many unknowns, too many interrelated factors. Those are the type of things that can be complex, that don't necessarily lend themselves to an RPA, as opposed to things that are complicated that still have very clear business rules. Obviously, that's the type of thing that we would want to incorporate RPA. So the idea here is to do what we call segmentation of roles. So you go through and you look at which roles are strategic, which are core, and what are supporting roles to the business. And even oftentimes you'll find that there are some misaligned roles. And the idea is that you want to make sure that those that are strategic and core, that you're able to leverage fully the intellectual property of your human capital. And then often those supporting roles, and certainly even misaligned roles, are the ones that lend themselves to RPA. So really the human capital strategy as we move through this milieu is that we've got to focus on sourcing, developing, and retaining roles which contribute to executing strategy and value creation. And that's where the principal focus should be. And one of the things that we do is we encourage our clients to build a success profile for those roles so that we can be very clear about which things lend themselves to the human worker versus the automated worker. And then kind of an extension of that is we're beginning to see a whole new set of roles that are coming into the marketplace. And I'll give some examples of that momentarily, but roles like trainers or explainers or sustainers are now part of that new ecosystem. So that leads us next to artificial intelligence, which is a subfield of data science and computer science. And the whole notion is that you can simulate human intelligence. And of course, Hollywood has all given us a very clear path to what that looks like. And if by chance I have any science fiction fans, the thing that I think of is the movie Blade Runner, where Deckard, who's played by Harrison Ford, is a detective that's trying to track down these replicants or robots that have been produced by the Tyrell Corporation. And the latest generation, Nexus 6, is somehow distinguished. And so Deckard's asking Tyrell Corporation, well, what is it that's unique about this particular generation? And Tyrell responds is that we have gifted them with the past. And Deckard says, well, you're talking about memories. So while that seems somewhat innocuous, that really is a look ahead to the future where with the density of data that we have now and the ability to really create these conditional trees, if you will, now we can have robots performing, based on a set of experiences and memories, if you will, that become very powerful. And I know all of you at some measure are accustomed to how that shows up in our daily lives. I'm always intrigued when I'm ordering on Amazon. Not only is it telling me what they think I would like, but they're also must be putting me in some kind of persona to say, oh, by the way, people who have bought this item also bought these other items. So this is the type of information that's being processed through artificial intelligence that's really changing the landscape in terms of how we work. So kind of staying in the financial vein, these are just a few case examples. I'll use expense policy management as probably more approachable example. So, now with artificial intelligence, you can detect employee expense violations such as disallowed or personal spending, unverifiable receipts, personal credit card usage, disallowed merchants, travel add-ons, that type of thing. And so, this is fabulous from the standpoint of, risk, compliance, and controls. But for our employees, they begin to fear that this is encroaching in their realm. And we have to be very mindful about how, again, this technology can coexist and really leverage the human talent that we all have within our organizations. And I'd be remiss if I didn't talk a little bit about the extension of AI, which is conversational AI. And in fact, one of my colleagues puts it that we may be in the digital age, but digits are becoming superfluous. And it wasn't that long ago when Xerox gave birth to the mouse, which of course changed the whole landscape from a graphical user interface viewpoint. But today, now it's the voice user interface. So again, using my sci-fi references, Captain Kirk talking to his watch to ask Scotty to beam him up is not so far-fetched anymore, maybe except for the teleporting part. But, this technology is here and clearly becoming more pervasive in terms of how we go to market and do business. And this is really just the first of this. I mean, the augmented reality, gestures, biometrics, visuals, all of that is being driven by conversational AI. And then, of course, the one that I have the most fun with, who knew that Disney was prognosticating the future, are these magic mirrors, which for any industry that is in concierge services, this is now the harbinger of how they're going to help us get our experience while we're at their facility or hotel. So these are the type of things that are transpiring with conversational AI. So again, now, how do we position this with our employees? And I think the thing that we need to do is remind them that without humans, really artificial intelligence is still pretty stupid. And when you think about the nuances, and here we talk about 4 of the critical elements in terms of designing conversational experiences, context, engagement, tone, memory, these are things that are not easily achieved, even with this compendium of experience that we're creating on behalf of AI. In context, the example I think of is, I tell Alexa, hey, remind me to buy groceries tomorrow, which seems like a pretty simple request. But when it's 1 in the morning, tomorrow could be an entirely different thing. And of course, engagement is dynamic, it's inconsistent. Tone, is filled with personality, emotion, even surprise. So these are very complex elements to designing really a conversational experience that our customers would ultimately be willing to accept. And so it's not computers that are going to grasp those nuances, certainly. It's only by interjecting humans into the process that works. Now, our storyline from a business standpoint is, hey, we're really moving from the science of the job to the art of the job. But that means we've got to rethink, the principles in terms of how, again, we're leveraging our human capital. Now, likely from your employees' point of view, they have a much more dystopian look at it. And even though it seems like the bots here have the leg up, the reality is the bots can't do but one of those jobs, whereas the other 3 jobs can only be performed by humans. And really the challenge now is to train people to scrutinize, question, and explain the decisions of a machine. And in fact, it's interesting that Capgemini recently came out based on their survey work to say that emotional intelligence is expected to increase by as much as 6 times in terms of the demand for human capital. And I think it's for precisely these reasons. When you look at a trainer, basically, this is a job that's emerging where personality trainers use natural language processing and computational linguistics to build intelligent agents and chatbots. And then the explainers are the ones that really help humans understand what the underlying rationale is. Recently, we used AI to create 7 pricing models for one of our clients. And immediately we got feedback from the sales organization that something was wrong. Well, there was nothing wrong at all. In fact, it was doing precisely the algorithms that the business wanted, but it had changed how pricing took place in the marketplace. But we hadn't fully explained what the drivers and the rationale were around that pricing. So this is extremely important, and as we have AI take on more of this complexity, we've really got to make sure that people understand what are the drivers, what are we trying to do as we continue to move towards incorporating artificial intelligence. And then the sustainers come in that place where we were talking about the new ethos and the ethical issues, really managing those trade-offs between profitability and societal interests. So that leads us to the digital employee experience. And of course, we really, with the advent of this century, we've clearly moved away from services to experiences, and all of that is driven by big data analytics and AI. So the question is, how do we use this in a way that entreats us to our employees and lets them be part of this evolving ecosystem? So one of the things that we suggest is that you look at a unified engagement platform. In other words, we have the technology now where we can pervasively use it to ensure that we're tapping the right cultural elements. We're obviously leveraging technology. We're thinking about the environmental conditions. So if 1 out of 2 people are no longer working within the confines of our office, how do we create that engagement experience for them when they're not here with us? So we have to create that sort of seamless employee experience across this unified engagement platform. And some of the ways that I suggest that you consider doing that is in these kind of 4, very pervasive areas. And the first is onboarding really starts before we have our employee at first day of business. And a lot of the applications that are out there now that are applicant tracking systems are beginning to recognize that and really using that as an opportunity to create that employee experience even before they're an employee. Engaging mobility and flexible working, certainly, again, back to that autonomous worker or remote worker. How do we make them feel part of that employee ecosystem? So collaboration tools such as Microsoft Teams or WebEx all provide an opportunity for immediacy and intimacy to overcome that lack of proximity. And of course, we've got Microsoft Office 365, which allows us to work really virtually from any location. And then a big part of this is empowering the employee voice. So as you all know, successful change is really predicated on having our employees be part of that transition. And there are some terrific crowdsourcing tools out there for performance management. I think of applications like 15.5, PerformYard, Reflective, that really recognize that we're working in a different way now, that the line authority, supervisor and direct reports, all in same proximity, all working on the same project, that's not really the landscape that we have anymore. So how do we give feedback, both constructive and evaluative? How do we give feedback? We've got to create that ecosystem again and really enjoin all of their colleagues in helping them from a performance perspective. And also extremely important is that we leverage their point of view for innovation. Just like what we've learned with Toyota and Gemba Walks, the real innovation often is sitting at the hands of our employees. And so there are instruments out there, innovation management systems, that help us really elicit and mine those innovations or potential innovations that are out there. And then finally, fostering a learning environment, learning organization. And what that really means is we've got to change some of the mechanisms that we use for learning. It's no longer the way that people are learning to sit in a classroom for endless days. So where that's going now is that a lot of that's getting incorporated into the workflow. So micro-learning platforms such as QStream or Exonify EdApp, that's precisely what they're doing. They're putting it there at the moment and at the instance where that employee needs that information and to work with it extemporaneously as opposed to trying to get into another system and have that learning experience. So really fitting that into the employee's workflows so that it's on demand is really important. So what I suggest as you look at that unified engagement platform is really understand and identify those human values at the root of whether it's customer experience or employee experience is experience design and design thinking. And the whole idea is that we really have those ethnographic conversations. We understand what the motivators are for our employees. We've really got to get to intrinsically that human value. And there's a lot of different ways to do that. But, you know, now these avenues in terms of the crowdsourcing, social listening, even organizational network analysis are ways that we can really get a pulse on what the prevailing thinking is and kind of emotional state of the business. And finally, you know, let's treat our employees no differently than our customers in terms of experience design. And we have to be very intentional if, in fact, we're concentrating our human capital in those strategic and core areas. That intellectual property is becoming much more important to us. And so we've got to make sure that we're creating a user experience that keeps them fully engaged and enriched. And, you know, that's something that we've got to be very mindful of in that platform. So finally, digital customer experience. This is probably the one that's most immediate to the things that we do relative to digitizing that customer experience. Obviously, these are the value points for a customer: reachability, service convenience, you know, personalization, simplicity of use, and obviously all of this in the palm of their hand. So we've got to construct all of our forward-facing solutions for our customers in a way that we're meeting all of those requirements. So what does that mean in terms of our human capital? Well, digital dexterity really is, as it suggests, a set of beliefs and mindsets and behaviors about capitalizing on you know, digital technology and really leveraging it so that we can be more effective with our customers. And some of the attributes that come from digital dexterity is obviously being open to technology's potential, willing to flex roles and take risks. So that goes back to how we define that ecosystem and really being mindful about what roles are most contributive from a human capital standpoint. And then willing to work in an iterative and collaborative way, as well as obviously possessing strong technology and data savviness. So we can pick up that last piece in sort of the traditional qualifications, but how do we look at the traits and tendencies and competencies that align with digital dexterity? And there are instruments in the marketplace that are able to really measure and look at those natural tendencies, and will people have a proclivity to embrace that technology and digital experience, and allow us even to use that in instances of hiring as well as training to understand what we need to do to kind of lift all boats and have that as part of the culture, and really create an environment where digital dexterity is able to thrive. So with that, my chat bot is open for any questions, as well as myself.
Thank you, Jeff. All right, let's see if anybody has any questions. Okay, I do have one here. All right. Do you have any tips for persuading skeptical executives to invest in change management, something many of them may not care about?
Yes, that's always the vexing question, isn't it? There's a terrific body of research and work that was done by, was led by Paul Nutt at the Ohio State University. And over 20 years, he studied substantive change initiatives, transformation projects. And one of the findings there was that delegated participation, which is having key individuals, employees that are involved in that transformation, actually accelerated the success by 60%. and reduce the time of implementation 40%. So I think we have to make the business case first and foremost for why change management is critical to the success of that initiative. You know, at the end of the day, if we understand that transformative value is really still largely at the hands of human intervention, then we've got to be very, very intentional and very mindful about that. And it's easy to get intoxicated with the technological side of the business. But if the sort of archetypal triad of people, process, and technology is still there, why would we put all our energy and effort behind the technology piece and not do the same around people and process? And that's really fundamentally what change management is there to support, is to ensure that that journey is a full journey and that we're accounting for people and process just as well as technology. Great question.
Thank you. Okay, one more here. Okay, so this is about regulations. How do you think regulations, government, ethics, spiritual, ideological, etc., can impact how we innovate and grow?
Wow, that's a granddaddy of a question there. Yeah, certainly when Amazon, it hasn't been that many years ago, maybe 4 or 5 years ago, when they filed for the patents for their haptic technology in wearables, there was quite the uproar, and there were factions that felt like that was in violation of some of their most inherent beliefs. So this is something that we're going to have to wrestle with really across the globe, and it really requires that rich conversation. And again, it's got to invite your people into that conversation. And there's only so much that regulation can do in terms of that. It's certainly provides some of the guardrails, but I think regardless of where regulation shows up, it's really what's important and what is aligned with the values of your business, and being very mindful about how you use technology and keeping it contextual to your core values and principles. That's the conversation.
Great, thank you. A few more on the executive questions. So you've talked a lot about how to manage change and ensure buy-in with employees, but what about at the executive level? So again, I think it's kind of how do you get the executives buy-in?
Yeah, I think stories are the most compelling. So however you craft those stories about the people that do the work, and certainly we're pretty good as a whole about doing that on behalf of the customers, but we've also got to tell those compelling stories on behalf of the employees. And my experience is when an executive gets grounded in how that work shows up for the employee, that they respond very, very well to that and understand the trials and tribulations that they are dealing with and or might have to deal with as a result of the change. So a lot of our work is understanding the impact, the nature of the impact, not only in terms of tools and processes and systems, but as importantly to the individual. How is that going to show up? What's the capacity for change? Has there been a great deal of change? What has change looked like in the past? Has it been successful? Has it been a failed effort? I mean, all those factors become really a very important part of the dialogue. So putting those stories together in a compelling way and sharing them with the executives is really a way to sensitize them to what is really happening as a result of the technology and what we're trying to do from a digital transformation perspective.
Okay, thank you everyone for these great questions. I have a few more here. What are some best practices for enabling executives to be effective change champions during transformation?
I think they need to understand what the strategy is from a change perspective and the component parts that go with that. And the one that is most immediate to most executives is we've got to communicate about change, but that's really only part of the story. So we've got to have a structured dialogue about change, just as we have a structured dialogue about the technological solutions. So we have to be just as deliberate about orchestrating that dialogue with the executives and talking about the things that have to happen from a people and process perspective, not just a technology perspective. Now, I know that's not always easy. You're dealing with limited time, but again, if you've been able to compel them either through user stories or through the economics of the increased success and decreased time to implementation, then certainly they should be willing to carve out some of that structured time to really talk about change. And, you know, we don't need to make them practitioners by any stretch. That's not what's necessary. But we do need them to understand kind of the principles around how we assess impact and try to mitigate that with the employees. And that's going to look different across different groups. And then communicate in an open and honest way at the right junctures using the right mediums, and ultimately enabling them for the change, which is not only training, but sometimes it's mindsets and a different way that we're going to market. So all of those factors are really critical for the C-suite just as much as they are for the rest of the company.
Great, thank you. Okay, last question. How do you map out new customer behaviors and expectations at SimsCorp?
That's a great question. We have a terrific part of our practice, which is around experience design. And I think I mentioned earlier about, you know, the ethnographic conversation, developing personas, understanding what those key motivators, how people relate to things emotionally. This is really the underpinning to creating not only a viable customer experience, but a viable employee experience as well. So we're very measured in understanding those personas and then assessing how do they view change. We try to get to the sentiments around that. Are they fearful? Are they optimistic? So we do a lot of work on the front end, which is very funny because I think most people think about it as being a back end thing, right? We got to get ready to communicate and train as we're getting ready to roll out this solution. And really the heavy lifting from a change standpoint is really doing it on the front end. So those are the vehicles that we use in order to really be mindful of that. I think I answered that question. Read it back to me one more time just so I can make sure I've got it, Kelly.
Yeah. It's how do you map out new customer behaviors and expectations?
Yes. Yeah, and same for the new customer behavior. Same type of process is really having that you know, very detailed discussion about how that's going to show up and work in their environment, and understanding the nuances around that, and what are some of the idiosyncrasies of the customers and how do we accommodate those. So yeah, that's absolutely right.
Okay, and Jeff, can you put your contact information back on the screen so we can share that with everyone?
Yes, and let me offer this. I know it's hard to get everything covered in such a short period of time. I'm happy to take some time by phone if you've got a situation and you're trying to evaluate whether change management would be effective to that, or you're just trying to understand what some of the implications are to your employees based on what you're implementing from a digital transformation perspective, I'm happy to take some time by phone and give you my thoughts and any suggestions that might help you in that journey.
Great, thank you. And thanks everyone for attending today. You will be receiving a follow-up email with the webinar recording and links to some future webinars. If you have any additional questions, feel free to email me directly at info@senscorp.com or Jeff's email addresses on the screen. Again, thanks for joining and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you, everybody. Appreciate you taking the time.